you, Judy. And it is truly an honor and a pleasure to introduce our next keynote speaker, my friend and colleague, Vera Allmanritter, one of the leading visitor studies researchers in Europe. Vera heads the Institute for Research on Cultural Participation, IKTF, one of the two co-sponsors of this conference. And IKTF is an organization she founded in 2020. Before that, Vera worked for several universities and as a freelance cultural manager for many years, but also in cultural organizations such as, for example, the Jewish Museum in Berlin. She does research on cultural participation, cultural management, cultural marketing, audience research, audience development, as well as empirical research methods. Her keynote today will deal with the very provocative question, making visitor studies relevant to relevance. How should we measure success? So without further ado, Vera, take it away.
Thank you very much, John. I hope that you can hear me now. Perfect, that helps. Hello, everyone. On behalf of all my colleagues at IKTF, I want to welcome you to this conference too. And I have the honor and at the same time, as John said, the difficult task to give a devil's advocate keynote here. Because in the following, I plan to discuss two questions. How does specifically visitor research currently help figuring out if a cultural institution is relevant, maybe even relevant to diverse audiences, which is actually my next slide that I can't click. Thank you. And do we researchers have functioning instruments required to deliver this information? And as I said, this is going to be a devil's advocate keynote. I'm sure you have already guessed that I'm not so sure that we have those instruments. Because this sounds so frustrating. Oh no, she's destroying my feel good. I would like to start with a fun fact that tells us some I think even quite important people think about that topic, and that they might think there is no need at all to bother with my critical questions. So what you can see on the screen now is a quote which I find very interesting in the context of measuring relevance of cultural organizations. At the end of 2021, the former German State Minister for Culture, Monika Grütters, summarized the impact of her last 8 years in office by saying, culture has gained relevance, not only for creative people and their audience, but for society as a whole. Cool. She goes on and justifies this statement by pointing out to a continuous increase in the state budget for the cultural sector, her own budget, by the way, even through the pandemic. But as you might know, although it is true that a large number of cultural organizations in Germany is publicly funded, and this might account as one marker for their relevance, it is mainly the task of federal states, and even more so the cities, to support culture. German State Minister for Culture might sound very significant also financially, but the share of her budget in the total expenditure on culture in Germany is only 15%. On top of that, and most certainly also in a lot of other countries as well, there are strained public budgets secondary to COVID-19. So it's to be expected that public funding will decrease on all levels within the next years. But does that mean culture loses relevance? I would definitely say no. It's also to be expected that not all political forces find this decrease in funding regrettable. But is this those forces alone that define relevance? I would again definitely say no here. So if you look at a very short definition of relevance, it says the importance that someone attaches to something in a particular context. So I would like to take a quick closer look at the question who that someone might be. And maybe the state minister's statement helps here, because in more detail, she did at least include some important stakeholders of cultural organizations for whom they might or might not be relevant. Relevance for creative people, relevance for their audience, relevance for society as a whole. Quite a lot of potential someones, and also groups that are interrelated for sure, but what about them? How could we find out if they attach importance to the public funding of culture, or maybe even to cultural organizations? Well, if you ask me, I would say using the rise and fall of funding alone is definitely not a very good indicator for relevance. And perhaps our minister was not so much into audience research if she uses that criterion. And this is where we come in. The question arises, how can audience research help us understand if a cultural organization is relevant or not, and for whom of these audiences, or maybe even also others? Well, one could state that high quality audience research reflects what information is needed by those who commission it. Usually, audience research is commissioned and funded by decision makers, for example, within cultural organizations or policymakers. And what they believe is needed is strongly influenced by societal developments, political discourses, and sometimes even simple funding criteria. Of course, this all works only well if those who commission audience research know what audience research data exists or could be collected and how to use it for informed decisions. This is often not reality, but let's pretend for a moment that it is. What we as researchers need to answer is, if they asked us for data related for relevance, would we researchers have functioning instruments required to deliver it? Of course, it's also the case that what visitors get asked in audience research by us reflects those same societal developments, political discourses, funding criteria, and our own knowledge and position in society. Public funded institutions are supposed to strive for reaching society as a whole, at least in Germany because of the public funding, or repeating a phrase often used in recent years, to be relevant to a diverse audience. In Berlin, for example, the concrete political aim has been that cultural institutions should reflect the composition of society within their staff, program, and visitors. So how can we, as researchers, begin to try to find out if the organizations are relevant, maybe even for a diverse audience, specifically using audience research? I think, broadly speaking, we could approach this answer from 4 different starting points. As a start, before we do any research at all, you would probably check the number of your visitors. Hopefully quite easy. The assumption would be, you have a lot of them, good, you're relevant. But we all know that they are visits, not visitors. And we also know that this number doesn't say anything about who's actually there or not. You could look who's actually visiting cultural organizations with the assumption that social groups that you find within the visitors find the offer relevant. But can we rest assured that we have done our job now if we leave it here? I would say certainly not. Timo Meinhardt has already told us that public value or relevance includes different dimensions. He also said that public value is that much a society-related issue that answers between different social groups might not vary that much. Means only looking at the structure of visitors is not enough. We need to take a deeper look and try to find out, for example, if visiting the organization creates value on the individual basis. We could try to find these answers by focusing on motives and expectations of visitors and whether they are being fulfilled. We could also look on the impact of specific stimuli on the visitors to explore if there is an increase in their well-being. John Falk will tell us more about this idea tomorrow. As far as I know, instruments used in this context, consistent with what Timo said, they all say that these answers are situation related and belonging to a certain social group should not have a large impact on answers, if at all. We could also try to find out if the organization holds value for the local population. Some even say we should also find out if the organizations create economic monetary value. Although this seems to me rather outdated neoliberal approach straight out of the 90s, but still people ask for it. One way to find such answers would be a focus, for example, on attitudes, opinions of visitors or potential visitors. Doing that, we could, for example, develop a list of statements describing the different dimensions of relevance, If a relevant sample of society agreed to such statements, such as museums encourage individual creativity, or museums are a good place for leisure activities, or cultural institutions reduce social exclusion, you could declare that they offer value for the general public. It sounds easier than it is. You can always give an empirical answer here. Something like, in a statement battery of 10 statements, at least a number of XYZ has agreed to XYZ%. And then we say, yes, they say something is relevant, but that might not have to do anything with reality. And the underlying assumption here would probably also be that social groups that agree most find the offer most relevant. So coming back to my two original questions, how does specifically visitor research currently help figuring out if a cultural organization is relevant for a diverse audience or not? And do we researchers have functioning instruments required to deliver this information? Looking at the state of art of visitor research, I would, in the following, like to focus on two approaches. Let's take a quick look on how those two approaches are implemented empirically and what that would imply as answers to my two questions. Your reaction might be a spontaneous piece of cake. We have been doing this for years. Everyone knows how to do that. That I want to take a deeper look here already tells you that I probably don't agree with that. So let's start with a deeper look on how we measure visitor structure. What do we specifically ask in visitor research, and how does this reflect the different dimension of social structure or diversity within the visitor structure? A very quick reminder, the dimensions of diversity can include many components, but very often they include gender, religious belief, race, ethnicity, age, education, physical and mental ability, social situation, income, or sexual orientation. Of course, etc., etc. I picked just the ones that I think are most common. Focusing on the standard social demographics, it becomes obvious that here, at least, we try to collect information about some dimensions of diversity. As part of standard social demographics, questionnaires normally include questions like biological sex, age, former educations, sometimes income. Sociology has been stating that social demographics alone don't help explaining social behavior since the 1980s. But questions about lifestyle groups or psychographics are rarely used in visitor studies, even though they could count as an indicator for the diversity criteria social situation. Oliver Tevis-Schünzel will tell us more about this approach tomorrow. Rarely used in visitor research are also questions on diversity dimensions like race or ethnicity, physical or mental ability, sexual orientation or religion. And of course, some of these questions are very personal and should only be asked if the information is really needed, and asking them in a four-year situation can be challenging, maybe not possible at all. But there seems also to be a general lack of research in how to do this work well and carefully. Are we aware that the instruments we use are very culturally sensitive? To give you a very striking example, let's stay with the dimension race or ethnicity. In German-speaking countries, we would ask for the so-called migration background, which means someone has a migration history. We would ask if he or she, or at least one parent, has had a different nationality than German. In the UK, we would probably ask for the race of the respondents and give answer options like Black, Asian, etc. Something that would be completely out of question in Germany because of our history. And in Canada, I know there's some Canadians here, so please correct me if that's wrong. We probably might want to find out if a cultural organization reaches Indigenous people, which would be something else entirely. On top of that, it seems to be that even the standard social demographic questions are not just naturally up to date in visitor studies questionnaires. Let's look at another striking example. Those commissioning the research very often want data that is comparable to data of statistical offices. Resident registration offices normally ask for biological sex. As a result, visitor research also very often tries to find out the biological sex of the visitors. But how do they ask it? Is it a question directly asking for it, like what is your sex, with the answer codes female, male? Is there an answer code for non-binary, a category recently included in resident registers in Germany? What would be the answer code for that? Do we ask people for their biological sex or what sex they identify with, which would be gender? How do we solve these issues if such a most certainly cultural sensitive question gets asked to locals, but also to tourists from all over the world? Another example, how do we ask for the level of formal education? Again, a lot of cultural organizations have visitors from all over the world, and still in visitor studies questionnaires, you mostly find categories that reflect educational qualifications of the country they are situated in. But a lot of tourists and also immigrants can't do anything with those categories. And it might be a fun fact here, but also a bit frustrating that empirical research as a whole seems not to have been able to decide if asking for the age of the respondents is better conducted by asking for years or for year of birth. So how can we say anything about the relevance of cultural organizations for different social groups or diverse audiences if we have maybe not yet developed the strong tools to describe the true diversity or lack of diversities found within our visitors? I would, as I said, suggest that we also looked at the questions of why someone visits a cultural organization as a marker for relevance. In most of the questionnaires that I have seen, and there John could correct me if he sees it different, I would find an at least rather seemingly random list of potential motives for a visit, instead of a use of a theory-based instrument like, for example, John Fawkes. John identified 7 visitor identities with different motives for a visit, which I cannot describe in depth here, but I guess a lot of you know them already. To give 3 examples: explorers with a strong general interest in the content of the cultural organization, facilitators who enable others to visit, experience seekers, often tourists who want to have made a museum. By understanding the visitors' entering identity-related motives, one can better create a fulfilling experience for them. Even if such an instrument is used, which I would say is rarely the case, it's also rarely the case that visitors get not only asked what they were expecting, but also if their visit gave them what they hoped for. So we might know now why someone is actually here, but not if what they have expected has been fulfilled. The result of such questions is not necessarily used to create different exhibits and programs. My guess would be that they are mostly used to create different visitor experiences around existing ones. This would be a completely different angle here, but we know from arts management research that there are further aspects that make cultural organizations and their offers relevant to different social groups on an individual level, as well as for society as a whole. I'm talking about things like, does what I see here have anything to do with my life? Do I find the quality of what I see, experience high? Do I find myself, my social group, reflected in the staff of the organization? Do I find myself, my social group, reflected in the program of the organization or artists? Do I see other people like me participating? And here I'm pretty sure that we would see differences in the answers of different social groups. And I'm also sure that discrimination and exclusion play a role here. Still, I've never nearly seen those aspects asked for in visitor research. So I dare to say some important aspects of relevance are missing in our questionnaires if we want to concentrate on diversity issues. As you will hear this afternoon, and I'm already very curious about that, at the Oakland Museum, they are studying if visitors to the museums both experience a sense of belonging and welcome, while also encountering opinions that are very different than their own. But even if we included some of the things I just mentioned in our questionnaire, I don't think they really measure the 4 relevance dimensions that Timo told us about sufficiently. I would love to take a deeper look at the instrument and these questions he uses to measure relevance within the general population and see if it could be asked to visitors of cultural organizations as well. Where do we go from here? Well, we all know it. In visitor studies, you can only find answers to questions that you ask. And how you ask them will also very much impact the results that you get. Plus, language and scientific categories have large impact here as well. If people feel they are not valued by visitor research, or worse, even feel discriminated by it, you certainly won't get any answers at all. Are we as researchers in the field of visitor studies currently diverse enough ourselves to measure relevance for different social groups? I'm not saying all this to bash visitor studies. I mean, I'm part of it, but rather as a means to reflect on how we are currently doing this work and why and how we could improve it. So my conclusion here would be, let's all start to work together on broadening and updating our approaches and our instruments. If we want to have any benchmarking at all here, we also need some standard instruments that we all use in the future. And maybe most importantly, let's all work on it together with the people from the groups we want to know more about. We would not only be measure how relevant cultural institutions are, but I think we would also make visitor studies more relevant.
Thank you, Vera. Very timely and provocative, and it will be interesting to see if somebody's thesis comes out of this. Maybe you've just created a new thesis, but we'd like to open the floor for questions, for comments. Does anybody know anyone who's doing work in this area, kind of pushing this envelope? So please, if you go down to the bottom of the screen and click on reactions, you can raise your hand if you would like to ask a question of Vera, or you can put it in the chat, whatever works best for you.
Comments are also welcome, of course. The very good thing, because we are online here, is that no one is actually able to throw tomatoes at me.
I can ask a question while people are, oh, good. Irene, please go ahead.
Thanks, Vera, for your presentation. Do you have a guess how the public value is being measured? So what Timo told us yesterday?
No, honestly, I don't. I tried to look just to Google if I found any articles where he showed this instrument, and 2 options, maybe he doesn't, or I didn't find them, but I will most certainly ask him after the conference is over if he would share it, because I find it really, really interesting. My guess is from what he said that it's probably something like statement batteries here, but he actually didn't really answer it, I think. Or I didn't hear it.
Because I know how you measure, and I understand all these things about diversity, and I understand that you can ask your audiences and you can ask non-audiences. So those are the things that I understand. But I think maybe this could be connected to the public value if we would know how we would measure this to how important cultural institutions are. I think it cannot go hand in hand with what Monika Grütter said, to say, okay, public budget is 1, 2, 3, or 10, then this is relevant. I mean, yes, but this cannot be the only thing.
No,
Absolutely.
thank you.
totally agree.
Norbert, please.
Can I quickly
sorry.
answer, Julie? I totally agree, Elena. I don't have those instruments at the moment as well. I would be really curious if we could use his instrument and maybe put also a smaller version in the questionnaires of visitor studies, or light version, kind of. I don't know. I guess it would also mean that the organizations who measure it, I mean, let's say they decide for themselves that they put the question in the questionnaire, that they have to be brave enough to use it and also talk about the results with their funders and not waiting for anyone else asking for them to measure it, because that's definitely, I comment it, more dangerous than being brave here.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you. And Norbert.
Yes, I'd like to know whether there is a deeper definition for relevance. What does it mean exactly? Does it mean that something's got a meaning to a person, or what is it exactly?
This is a very good question. And I can only say that for this keynote, of course, that was the first thing that I tried to Google. What would be a kind of general definition for relevance that we could use here? I mean, we need at least some definitions, otherwise we can't go on working. And honestly, the only that I found was the one that I read out in the beginning: the importance that someone attaches to something in a particular context. This is super broad, of course. It means that if we think of visitor studies, that someone has to define it. And we already discussed it yesterday, sorry, that it's probably the person commissioning the visitor research, and the definition could be different from organization to organization or from person to person who commissions it. It seems to be that there is no general answer what it is. And I would also say that it probably, if it's, as Timo said, a more societal issue, it probably changes over time as well. I mean, what is relevant, what we all here consider as relevant today, is probably not the same that people considered relevant even 5 years ago, before the pandemic.
Yeah. Thank you. Kara, please.
Good morning. Thank you so much for this relevant conversation and timely. This is particularly interesting and a passion of mine as well. And I'm curious, you mentioned the sense of belonging component as being a part of creating more diversity and inclusion. Can you just speak a little bit more about that? Like, speaking of definitions of relevancy, can you maybe define sense of belonging or its purpose and go a little more depth into that? Thank you so much.
That could be a completely different keynote entirely. So I still try to give a very short answer. Looking at all the studies that I've seen in the wider field of visitor studies, and I mean asking visitors and also asking non-visitors, I would say that one of the main aspects, if people are interested in those offers or maybe even visit them, is if they say it does have anything to do with their life. The topic interests them, whatever they see, experience, that resonates in them. It has anything to do with what they do, what they are, or what plays a role in their social surrounding. That's why I said I think it makes absolutely sense to ask for that. Don't ask me how. It's not that easy, especially not if you ask the visitors. In the population study, it's at least a little bit easier, not easy, but a little bit easier. But what I find is that aspects like, do I really feel reflected here? Or does that really play a role in my life or in my surrounding? That's just not questions that people get asked. I mean, if you look at the questions that you normally have in questionnaires, why people don't go, mainly non-visitor research, a lot of answer codes, or the most answer codes that I've seen are something like, oh, I don't have time, I don't have money, I don't have enough, I don't know, free time, something like that. And it's, of course, it's also the most common answers that people give. And then sometimes in those studies, there's a comment saying, there are probably other reasons behind it that people don't tell us. For example, that they don't feel comfortable here, or that they have the feeling they don't belong here, or that they have the feeling they don't know the rules, how to behave there. There seems to be an expectation how to behave there, and they don't really know it, or they don't want to behave like that, or they even think people who are visiting don't want them here. It doesn't have to be the organization. It could also be people going there who kind of tell them or not tell them that that's not their place to go. And this is also not really part of studies with a large number of participants. Mostly it's just said, do find out that in qualitative interviews. But we all know of course, qualitative interviews are cool, but we all know if we use them for those aspects, people will say, this is not representative, which means it doesn't play a role.
Yeah. Thank you. And Suzanne has a question or a comment.
Yes, we have to, within a year, change the way we do these surveys in our museum. And we have to do it ourselves instead of another government-run agency. And I've noticed that we ask about 1,000 visitors a year, different kinds of questions that we don't make up ourselves. And I find it difficult to figure out now how to ask the questions. No matter what, it's difficult to find out what questions, but it depends how you ask the questions. You will get different answers, of course. If we ask them face to face, the answers tend to be much more positive than if you give them something to answer in private. But face to face is much more expensive because you need staff to do that, and a questionnaire which you can answer by computer or your device or whatever, it's much more true, but they don't tend to answer if you send them a questionnaire. So it's have you any ideas or thoughts about that, the best way to go?
It's a very good question. Thank you for it. Actually, I left that out of my keynote to not make it even more complicated, because of course, that's absolutely true. And to make it even worse, I mean, there are some questions that I already talked about that I find really not okay to ask people face to face. I mean, this is definitely not anonymous at all then. And some of them are quite sensitive questions. And it's possible that people feel offended. They don't answer, probably. Maybe they're really angry at the organization where the survey gets conducted, also not very helpful. Or they don't tell the truth here because they think it's socially more accepted to say something else. So, I mean, if you ask face to face, normally more people take part. So, and it's quite quick because you don't have to read out everything. You can just ask open questions. How did you find out about today's offering? And then people just say something and don't have to read 30 answer codes that are possible. But at the same time, it gets quite complicated when you have questions that are sensible. So what we do at the moment is kind of a compromise. We here in Berlin in our Kuhlmann system have face-to-face interviews, and for some questions the interviewers hand out the device to the respondents, asking them to answer themselves, and just give the device back when they are finished, to at least somehow create an environment that makes it anonymous. Not completely, because it's still in a foyer situation, but better than nothing.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
And I think there was a comment by John.
Yeah.
He said it also matters when you ask. Yes. Yeah. Volker. then let's go to Martin first. And
No, I'm here now.
Okay.
Excuse me. Hi, Vera. I really completely agree with your critical view of the current visitor research, but we have to see the institution, the cultural institution in the field of different kinds of relevance, for example, for the society as a whole, and the areas like for science or the political sphere, educational, economic sphere, or cultural sphere, of course. And so cultural institutions have really to behave in it. And I think we have to behave to consider it, because it's not only the visitors they are really account for. And I think what we have to see is maybe we have I don't think we have completely to forget social demographic things like elder people. We have some target groups, for example, like elder people or families, younger people. And we have also to consider the educational level or the money income, but they are not to see in the isolated view, because we have to see the interplay of these demographic things with the motives described by John Falk, or the expectations or the reception matters, or maybe also the quality of the relationship to a cultural institution. And so I think we have to see it, and maybe we have to really to consider it when we work out a concept of relevance in the audience research. Okay, thank you.
I
And
can
Martin,
only
sorry,
nod
Vera.
here. I can only nod here and say yes.
Martin.
Well, thank you, and thank you very much for your talk, Vera. I think a good point you have, and a very important thing is that we take a look about who is commissioning these different surveys we're doing, and also kind of course, as you said, there comes money from different angles, and then we do the survey. But as I'm coming from an institution, as a museum myself, and a thing that I believe that the museum should be more aware of is how they can use it and how they can influence the survey which are being done. Because as you said, the data you have is the data you're going to use, and sometimes you kind of then you will have some discussion and not actually are discussing the thing. A thing which I also found is interesting, and I thought could be more useful to dig more into is to be more curious about your visitors, as you kind of said that there are likely that there are relevance there, but as far as I have been seeing and the research we're trying to do, we are getting surprised all the time. We're saying this should not be for you, but it is. And of course, that's also a question of, then you have to talk with people and have to do interviews with people. But sometimes it's just too simple, and maybe do fewer, more qualitative research in part of it than just taking the general thing. I don't know if you have any experience of way to do that where you actually can get more surprised. Because what I think is the problem with these commissions, they're done for a purpose, and when they fulfill the purpose, they're fine. And if there's surprises, it's actually a problem.
Ooh, hard to answer. I mean, if I think of one thing at least, what could be done is that maybe those who actually conduct all the surveys have a catalog with suggestions what you could ask, instead of just doing what he or she is told to include in the questionnaire, because I'm pretty sure, even if we don't think about the topics that we just talked about, that maybe sometimes the organizations don't know what to ask, sometimes not at all, or maybe sometimes not much about current topics at the moment. And then they don't know what the question could look like. And of course, they don't have to know, because you have the people who commission it, who should have the expertise to do it. What also happens from time to time is that those who conduct the studies don't agree on a method level with what the organizations want. I stay with the question that I discussed earlier on sorry for all the Americans here, the sex questions in the questionnaires. It can happen that the one who conducts the studies, the visitor researcher, says, hey, you know, there is a third category. And I mean, I think we should ask it, because if we don't ask it, it's kind of discriminating, you know? And then sometimes the organizations say, no, you don't, because I think you can't ask the visitors, my visitors, this question with a third category, because they get really angry. I mean, then the question arises, who decides what gets asked here, and who maybe has to survive that the answer categories are surprising to them. What's better here?
John.
Yes, so I was just going to weigh in on this issue, and again, I am disproportionately talking from the U.S. context, but I have a sneaking suspicion that it will be generalizable to other contexts as well. That absolutely, when researchers come in, the organizations are disproportionately seem to be driving what should and shouldn't be asked, and typically they are exceedingly naive. But the problem goes back even one step further, because more often than not, the organizations are asking those questions because their funders are demanding that they ask these questions. And the funders are even more naive and even more conservative. So it's often a government funder, and they're the ones, again, in the US context, who are demanding for these demographic categories, for example. You know, as a rule of thumb, I always like to believe, why would you ask a question if you're not going to use the information? And more often than not, they're not using the information except to satisfy these funders. So that then raises a power question, whether we, as the social science researchers, have the ability to move that landscape and move the dynamics to be more sensitive, as you rightfully point out, Vera. And I don't have a good answer to that one, but that's an observation.
I don't really have an answer here too, John, because I guess it depends a little bit on which situation you are in personally. I mean, if you have to earn money conducting that research and you are not a publicly funded research institute, it's probably hard to push. You can suggest and push a little bit, but you always have the risk that you can't conduct it anymore. What I find maybe a bit ironical here is that you said that they only collected to satisfy the funders, because in my experience, in a lot of cases, the funders later on are not really even interested in the numbers, but only want to have the number of visitors, a number that doesn't have to do anything with those aspects at all.
Or it's ticking off a box.
Yeah.
We want to be able to say that, you know, we spent our money well, so we did an evaluation, but you know, the information sits on a shelf, right?
Exactly. As I said, no one here wants to bash anyone. In German, we would say we all sit in the same boat here.
Yeah.
It's more the question, how do we get out of the boat or push it in a different direction?
I was really struck by your point, Vera, that it's not just which question, it's how to ask the question. What is the way to ask the question that you get reliable and valid results? And I know at the Art Gallery of Ontario, Carrie Ryan, who was the person in charge of visitor research there, spent a year testing different ways of asking the racial ethnic background question, to get the right way of asking it that wasn't offensive and that created the least number of refusals. And so it seems like maybe this is something a few organizations could come together to test the question, the how, and you know, to create across a group of organizations a test. I know John has suggested this in the past. What if this year we focus on this question and next year we focus on the next question, and over 5 years we have then developed some skill and some validity. So,
and even to the point, the importance of ultimately having some concurrence and similarity in the way we ask these questions, because ultimately, if not, what happens is you can't even compare other studies against each other, because if even at the simplest level, if for example, age, if everybody is defining age or family differently, then you can't compare two studies that looked at families. If both studies define a family differently, you can't compare them. And so in the interest of creating some useful compendium of research, it behooves us to come to some agreement on at least some basic measures.
I totally agree to the both of you, to both large aspects here. I mean, normally people who conduct those studies don't have any money or time to do that testing at all. I mean, it is obviously the task of the research institutes, hopefully the publicly funded institutes, to do it. We also try to do it. And funny, John, we also try to, the plan is actually the same, to look at all those instruments over the next month, because we all know it takes time, and probably revise a lot of them because we think they are not okay anymore. And of course, this never stops, because it's a typical scientist principle that you do it at one time and you use it until you realize, okay, it's not okay anymore. You have to revise it again.
So, any other questions, comments? We've opened a big can of worms here. Yes, Norbert.
That was the plan, wasn't it, Judy?
It was absolutely the plan, Vera. Thank you.
So, a couple of days before, I talked to a responsible person from a huge art museum in Germany. I asked her whether they are doing audience research or not, and she answered they don't do it any longer, because the answers are always the same, and they think that they can preview or foresee the results, so it's not any longer necessary. What would you answer them? I hadn't got no idea. I hadn't got any idea to answer, and so maybe you're the scientist.
Yeah, I try to answer as a scientist, but of course I think that nearly everyone listening here can also give an answer to that. Maybe we have different ones. As a scientist, I would say, it might mean that you're not asking interesting questions here. Maybe you should think about changing your questionnaire if you always get the same answers, or they are not interesting at all. And I mean, of course, you can decide that you don't ask all the questions all the time, but maybe just some 1 year and then 2 years later, if you know that it's something that probably doesn't change that quickly. I would also say, maybe you don't invest that much in changing your visitors, because if you don't see any change in the numbers, and at the same time you have programs trying to reach new or other target groups, and you don't see any change in the numbers, it's probably not a very good sign. I don't know. I would always say it makes sense to do these studies continuously, because then you don't have any comparison over time if you don't. Not sure if that answers your question. I mean, everyone please add here.
It looks like perhaps Martin has a thought.
Yeah, I have a thought now, because maybe the thing is also that they don't going to use it, and I think that's in some way it's very relevant, because you should never do any kind of investigation if you don't want to use it, and probably it could be the reason they have thought it will just be too much problem of changing your audience or trying to do whatever. So for that, it's not a interesting issue. I would say, of course, when you are in a cultural institution, you should have a desire to do something more, or to, not necessarily that everybody should visit your place, but at least have some points of who's going to do that. But when you don't, I think in some ways it's legitimate to say, then I don't ask the question, then I don't go for them. And in some ways I understand it, and as an issue I also think which is problematic. I mainly know from practice in Denmark. Sometimes we do the same question, or different institutions do the same questions, and in some way it's silly. We got slightly different results, but we could use our effort more if we then could kind of say, now they are doing these questions, I'm not, so I could do something else. I think that's also a problematic part in the whole sector, that sometimes we're just doing the same instead of kind of trying to divide it.
Not collaborating within the field. Yeah. Francesco, please.
Yes, thank you. I have the impression that the problem with visitor studies, visitor research in the practical work in museums, from my point of view, but probably it's quite the same in other cultural institutions, is that the management is not really. It's not. There are just some examples of management staff really understanding what visitor research means. There are a lot of management professionals which are just aware it is important somehow, but they don't really get it, what this mean, and exactly the fact of using the research or to draw conclusions, to change work, to really change management of cultural institutions. My experience is that they really have no idea, or really a very vague idea. And just by the fact of having someone doing visitor research, for example, makes their conscience kind of be happy. But yeah, I mean, I think we need really a change, and probably it's happening along years, like decades of years, to have management staff in the cultural institutions which are really aware of this topic in its details, not just that there is visitor research. It's the same problem as director of museums often are art historian and not manager. You know, where is the expertise? Which expertise is needed for leadership in a cultural institution? And very often, or usually, it is a specific expertise, competence, which is not, I mean, the same thing as Volkswagen would be led by an engineer, which only knows about building cars, but not about MBA or economics. You know, that sometimes we have some kind of this kind of structures in the management of cultural institutions.
Just the one sentence comment, Julie. you totally got me, Francesco, because you might remember that I said the research is normally commissioned by decision makers within the cultural organizations, and this is also very often not the case. It's people who quite low in the hierarchy of the institutions who commission it, and then they have issues to communicate this to their bosses and to push them to change behavior or change the behavior of the whole institution. Absolutely.
That's right. I think we're supposed to go to break now, but we have 2 more questions. And so if people want to slip away to refresh, get their lunch or refresh their coffee, you can do that. But Vera, if you're open, maybe we could have a few more questions, and we regroup in 15 minutes to have the next network session, and then another so half hour from now for the beginning of the concurrent session. So just to keep the thinking clear and the schedule clear. But let's take these 2 more comments that we have from John and from Dave, and then but if you slip away, we won't be offended because this is the scheduled break. So, John.
So I will just be very brief and just say, first of all, Francesco, you're absolutely right. And Vera, you were absolutely right. But in the spirit of Vera's talk, being provocative, I would also say that the people on our side, the visitor studies people, are equally at fault because we are not sufficiently sensitive of the priorities and needs of leadership. And we are not asking questions in our visitor studies that are relevant to someone who's managing an organization. And so we equally need to think about how do we ask better questions in ways that actually are relevant to organizational management. And if we ask those questions, then maybe those managers will pay more attention.
Thank you. And Dave?
Well, one aspect that hasn't been brought up is that I think sometimes management is afraid of getting results from the evaluation studies, and they don't want to hear criticism because it means everything isn't going perfectly, and that they view that as negative, and rather than something for improvement, they don't want to hear it.
Yes, the fear of the results.
Yes.
Yes. Vera, did you want to respond to that?
I was just thinking that maybe we all need some chocolate now.
Okay. All right. We'll move to a break, and we will see you for the next networking session very shortly. Thank you. Thank you, Vera.
Thank you.